Good afternoon and welcome to today's program on GDPR and data privacy. This event is brought to you by the Pacific Northwest Defense Coalition and Graybox. First, we want to confirm all those joining us online can hear and see the screen. Just type yes in the question field if you're all set. Great, thank you so much. Please feel free to use this same question field to ask a question at any time during the program. Just type your question in the webinar dashboard and we'll share it with our speaker. A recording of this presentation will be available after the event. You can also download a copy of today's PowerPoint as well as a copy of upcoming PNDC events under the Handouts tab. On today's program, we will be discussing GDPR, a serious data privacy law that impacts all businesses that market to, operate in, or are accessible from countries in the European Union. Its wide sweeping rules affect almost every company in the U.S. and are setting a precedent for new domestic legislation. The pending data privacy law proposals in Washington state are making security and compliance and data practices essential. We are very pleased to have Paul Weinert, Managing Principal and Founder of Graybox, here today to cover the impacts, options, and approaches for keeping your business in legal compliance, avoiding major fines, and staying agile with changing market demands. Paul, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your considerable expertise. I will turn things over to you to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the time, and hopefully I can educate everybody a little bit about this new legislation and new compliance rules. I'm going to get started. Basically, I appreciate everybody's time, and I think this will be hopefully informative. As Kate mentioned, we'll have time for questions here at the end. So I'm just going to get started. So first, just I want to intro me and sort of a little bit my credentials and sort of what our company is. Graybox, the short way I describe it is if it touches the internet, we can probably help with it. Overall, that works pretty well as explaining what we do. We started the company 10 years ago. We're about 40 different employees. We call ourselves a digital technology consulting firm. That means there's lots of different types of problems that businesses and organizations of all shapes and sizes have, and they can either be solved or organized or better executed with some sort of digital or internet-based tool set. And we help design, craft, build, or implement those things. We have about 115 active clients, and most of those are here located in the Northwest. Also, most of our employees are here in Portland, Oregon, even though we also have a presence. We have about 20% of the staff that's remote all around the country. If you guys are curious what I look like, I'm the handsome devil here on the left as well. A little bit about us. We do four main types of work. We do strategy work, creative, technology, and consulting. Those are very different things. Strategy is much more about like intentional planning and trying to figure out what are we trying to do and what are we trying to accomplish. Creative is about more of the craftsman and more bespoke planning and what is this thing supposed to feel, how is it supposed to function, what do we want users to understand, that sort of thing. Technology is our biggest group. It's about half our staff, and that's all about the building and execution of things. And then lastly is sort of one of the topics we're talking about today, and it's more about business consulting. And it's basically helping organizations of all sizes understand and optimize their operations because of things around the internet or implementing new tools or sort of transforming their organization in a new way just for the digital future sort of that we're all in. So that's for the high level. So going into GDPR, GDPR is a very big new concept. The EU passed it about a year ago, or it's been enforced for about a year. In GDPR, in a fast way, it's very new. It's very big and complicated. It is evolving as a global standard. I'll talk about that later in the presentation. It is unfortunately not easily implemented. It's something that has to be really contextualized and put together in a framework of ongoing improvement and care inside of each organization. And the way that's accomplished is totally different depending on your constraints and constructs. And so I'll walk through sort of high-level goals a little bit later, but it's definitely unique per organization. And then lastly, it is an ongoing campaign and commitment inside the organization for data privacy standards. And so it's honestly never really done. If anything, it's accomplished and then sort of put on pause for a while, but those processes and things that are happening behind the scenes still need to continue to occur. So unfortunately, it's just sort of something that part of everybody's life now. And then just a big disclaimer, like Graybox, we're not a law firm. And so one thing when we've worked with our clients about this topic is we're always partnered with a legal department or either a in-house legal team or outside counsel, just because it's a big law. There's lots of little minutia pieces to it, and we don't want to come off that like we're the only experts on this thing. And so we want to make sure that you're always working with your legal team. I don't know who's on the webinar right now. If you guys are the legal team, great. If you're not, please make sure to talk to your legal team inside your organization. Scope. So just framing about what GDPR is first, it impacts everybody. First and foremost, it's about data privacy standards and protection for European Union citizens. That does mean that it's European Union citizens wherever they might live. And so it's not just about the geographicness of Europe. It's also about you could be a British person living in America and you would still have an expectation of data privacy. So it's all businesses that operate in the EU. It's any business that markets to EU citizens wherever they might live in the world, and people that would collect data on EU citizens either in a intentional way or non-intentional way. My title here was GDPR Impacts Everybody because it's really hard when you have anonymous users coming to your website or coming to your applications. You don't know if they're EU citizens or not because that's not a question you ask. And so it sort of basically, as a result, applies to everybody. So that's fun. Then compliance and fines, it came into effect a year ago. In the first 9 months of the law, which is the most recent data I could find, the EU has brought up 206,000 cases already in the first 9 months. Most of those are not to gigantic companies, but they're for small companies. And what they've so far chosen to do is they have a lot of different types of punishments that they can roll out if you're not in compliance as an organization. The scariest, biggest one is they can fine you the greater of 20 million euros or 4% of all of your annual worldwide revenue. That is not 4% of profit. It is definitely of revenue, and they take the higher of those two things. They've never done that, thankfully, in the first year. So almost all those 206,000 cases, they have basically just put out either a warning, like, hey, you're on notice, we're watching what you guys are doing and how you're going to get into compliance, or they can do like a legal mandated stop of your current data collection efforts. So that's an interesting dynamic, is that they have the ability to do lots of fines, but so far in the first year, they've only doled out $55 million worth of fines, and most of those have been to our good friend Google. Fines are also solely at EU's discretion, and so there's basically like a case process, and then they can choose how to fine or punish, but it's totally at their discretion. So I also wanted to start with some definitions. There's a couple slides here, but there's lots of terms as you guys are doing reading about GDPR that are kind of hard to understand, and so I just wanted to walk through what those basic ones are. First one is there's two types of user data, and this is a huge distinction in the law. First is what they call aggregate data, and that is all the data you collect in a non-specific way on all users within your digital systems. So that could be browser cookies, that could be analytics, like think Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, like the general analytics tools. That could be how are these people using these tools? How are the people in Oregon using this tool? Like it's a thing where it's not identifiable. You don't know that it's Jim Smith, but you just know that Jim Smith might be in the big pool of everybody else. So it's the big aggregation of all the anonymous data. So then they have another distinction called personal data, which is very, very, very nebulously defined. Basically, it is any specific information related to all the aggregate user data that leads to a personal identification of one person. So that could be anything. So that could be a name. So there's a name field. You guys have a form, and it's first name, last name. We now know that Jim Smith filled out a form. You now have personal data on Jim Smith. It could be an email address. It could be a phone number. It could be an ID number. It could be their IP address. It could be their physical address. It could be lots of things. Heads up, there's a train coming, and so it might get loud here in a second, but we'll hold tight. The other piece of it is you can combine any of those little factors. So let's say you don't have name and email, but if you can use a variety of your aggregate data in combination to pinpoint down to one user. So let's say I know that I have age information and I have profession information and an IP address, and thus I can get down to the 50-year-old Jim Smith in Troutdale, right? By working through those little pieces of data to pinpoint to one person, then that now also counts as personal data, even though it was originally aggregate data. Hopefully that distinction makes sense. So basically, via segmentation, you can pinpoint down the personal data. So why those apply is there's this notion of consent. Is I, as an individual that's using your website, that's using your application, that's filling out the email or whatever it is, or placing an order, I basically have the right to my personal information that now I'm giving you, and it's mine, and you have it on loan with my permission. So consent must be freely given, informed, specific, and unambiguous. And that is for all data, include aggregate and personal. And so this is really important, and we'll talk about like basically writing standards a little bit later. But it's important that we aren't doing this thing called blanket consent, where it's like, by using this website, you agree that we will use data to track things. Instead, we want to make sure we're writing policies that are very specific and that are something where somebody can always have the choice to opt in. We're not assuming they opt in by just going to the website or just by logging into the app. Secondly, if we take personal data, so as soon as we take that name or email address, we're supposed to ask for explicit additional consent. So that means that you were on the website, so there's some aggregate data that's being tracked about you being there. But then once you fill out that form, there should be an additional checkbox that then says, yes, I understand that you're going to use this data and put it in my database and use it for X reasons. A couple other ones, breach. So there's this notion of a breach that's really important. And a breach could be something that sounds more scary, like cybersecurity, where it's like somebody came in and hacked your servers. But it really, in the concept of this law, it's also about uncontrolled user data being utilized. And so you're supposed to keep like access logs about who has access to which data. And those people are authorized to see the marketing data, but then you hire an intern and they're not supposed to see it, but they still see it. Like technically that could be considered a breach. This is a gray area where it's really poorly defined because they just say uncontrolled or unintentional, but like what does that mean? And that's where some good dialogue with your legal department about risks is really important to understand. Technically, you have 72 hours to provide notice to users about that breach, as well as providing notice to the EU. Then these last three are all related to each other. They do not use the word organization or company or anything like that. They use the word controller. And the controller is basically everybody on the call. You are the company or person that decided to collect or process data. So you are controlling the fact that you're gathering data. That's most likely you as a company. A joint controller is then a third party that the controller pays or basically partners with to do the collection on your behalf. So this is often Graybox. This could also be like MailChimp or Google Analytics or other sort of third-party software things or software companies where you are asking them, hey, could you go out and collect this data for me? And then lastly, there's a processor, which I don't think happens as often for most companies, but this is a third-party analysis company where they are not doing collection, they are doing segmentation, profiling, evaluation, or something on your behalf, and that's not done internally. So let's say you guys have a data science organization that you pay to go, hey, go find me what my best zip code markets are, or go find me this thing. That would be an example of a processor. This slide's really important. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this one. So the root of everything in GDPR is this idea sort of like in America, like our Bill of Rights, like we have standards of like, hey, I have a right to a free press. I have a right to these things. GDPR is trying to set a standard saying, as an individual, your data is your data, and you have rights to control that data about you as a person anywhere it's utilized or stored. So there's eight pieces. These are the 8 evaluation protocols, and they all have different standards of things that need to happen in an organization to make sure you can accomplish these objectives that a user would request. So the first one is, as a user, I have the right to be informed. So that means I get to consent that before my data is about to be collected, and I can choose yes or no. That means from a technical level that our tech teams need to make sure that no aggregate data tracking occurs until that user consents. And so there's some scripting things that we can do to basically say this pop-up has to happen or this modal or something has to happen. And the user can then opt in to aggregate tracking. And if they choose not to, they can still use the experience, they can still use the website, they can still do the things, but I'm not allowed to turn on my trackers. And so before in internet, that was like assumed that, oh, just turn on trackers, as soon as the page loads, you're going to start tracking stuff. They're trying to turn that back and make that all tracking is always by opt-in. Secondly is the right to access. That means that as a user, I can make a data request to you, the controller, and I can see all the data you have about me. That sounds, as a human, that sounds really nice as a person, but as a company, I go, how am I supposed to give that person this information? You think of all the places you might have data stored about one user. You could have it in your CRM, your marketing platform, your email marketing platform. Let's say you have a customer data place. You're doing like personalization, so there's some sort of customer data processor. There could be lots of places that you have things. Warehouse management, addresses, payment details, like all those places where you might have information about a user. Technically, you're supposed to be able to request, and you have a month to return back to them all the data that you might have about that one person. Right of rectification is meaning I can update information that is incorrect. So let's say I filled out a form, I then later I have a 1-month timing where I ask for the information, you send me that information, then I decide the information, I'm okay that you have it, but that information is incorrect. Please update the information with the details I'm going to send back to you. They can send you information and you're supposed to update it in your system. Next one is right of erasure, meaning I can delete the information I want deleted. This could be all information or partial information. So they could ask you for a partial delete. So yes, you can keep my name and email address, but please get rid of my physical address and please get rid of my IP address. They could do that. Again, you have a month to comply. So they can delete a partial or all of it. The next one's get a little bit more nuanced technically, but one is the right to restrict processing, meaning I can say, you know what, you can keep the data you have, but you aren't allowed to use it. Just put a pause on using it. This is complicated technically, but they have the right to do it. You then have to send them back basically proof or evidence that you have stopped processing with their things, with their data. So that could be like an email marketing campaign or automated campaigns or website personalization or something like that, where you are going to stop using the information even though you're allowed to keep it on file. You aren't allowed to use it for automated purposes. This one, I can't imagine why a person would want to do this, but they're allowed to do it, is the right of data portability, meaning I can say, hey, you company, give me all the information you have about me, and then I want to be able to take it and go find another company and give all the information that you got about me, I can now give it to somebody else. The way most companies are rolling this out is they're just trying to get all the data they give back to their users in a pretty standard way. So it's not like a weird file type. It's like a CSV file or an XML file, some sort of standard technical document. And that way people could put it into another system if they wanted to. Then the right to objective use, meaning that if you're telling me the ways that you're using my data, I have the right to say, yes, okay, I get it that I'm in for these 5 different marketing campaigns that are automatically happening, but I really object to 2 of them. So you can keep doing these 3, but you can't do these 2. And that's the user's call. That's not your call. Then lastly is they have the right to control or be notified of automatic profiling. So this means that when you have a big customer list and then you apply some sort of segments or profiles to them. So for instance, I want to market to all the men and women in my database differently. So if you make that segment happen, so you made a list that's split on the attribute of gender and you split it into different groups, then they technically have the right to now be informed, or you're supposed to automatically send them a notice immediately that you just profiled them based on this characteristic. And so that could be by age group, that could be gender, that could be demographic, could be assumed income level, lots of different things. People that like cats, people that don't like cats. Like if you make that list, you're supposed to tell them about it automatically. So Europe calls all these the various individual rights, and it's really the cornerstone foundation of the law. Is as companies, we're supposed to be respectful of these 8 rights and do everything we can to follow them. So options. This is the point where most likely everybody's feeling like a little overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, this sounds terrible. I don't want to do it. So let's talk through options. So I like these 2 quotes a lot. I found them online. But the first one is kind of long, but I'll just read them. The thing about GDPR is you never know when a breach is going to take place. One of the biggest challenges that I think comes with GDPR is how do you enable an ongoing program within the enterprise? It is not a tick box exercise. There is a fundamental change required inside of the enterprise in order to comply on an ongoing basis with the GDPR. Then this other one on the right, GDPR is forcing organizations that have the personal data of Europeans to treat that data in a reasonable manner and to be good custodians of that data. It's about making sure that the way that they use the data aligns with the expectations of European citizens. We have seen now this concept of GDPR spread globally, more globally than expected. GDPR is, in terms of its concept and what it tries to do, is now being consumed by other regulatory bodies. So what's happening is it's becoming this emerging data privacy standard. We're just like cybersecurity is really never done. We'll talk about that in the next slide. As organizations, we have to embrace this notion that I am respectfully treating my users' data with their permission and with intentionality always going forward. And so that means it's not, unfortunately, a one-time exercise. It's not, hey, yes, great, we can now transact credit cards, we're good, or some other examples of that, right? It's something that requires internal process change. It typically requires some sort of key stakeholder or head that has a lot of organizational power inside of the group that can own this as a new category that all organizations need to work with in moving forward. Almost all the examples I've given so far have also been about marketing data, but that's not necessarily true. It can also be it's about any type of data that you have about people in a stored in a digital way. So the other example that happens a lot in operations is your employee data. There is like an HR employee data, employee file sort of component to this too that we've seen applied a few times. So it's about internal process change that is a really collaboration across legal, marketing, sales, operations, technology, and HR. And so it requires really a really key executive stakeholdership to push it through an organization and then keep this as a thing that occurs over and over. Generally, who we've seen with our clients, the spearhead is the legal or the compliance department. But I could also see this living with like a COO or operations head as well. So you really have three options as an organization. Like, what are you going to do about this? We've kind of seen all three. So first is you can just block the EU countries completely. Now we've rolled that out a few times with different people. This is basically the idea that we're going to at least get rid of the majority of the problem by just eliminating. I don't market to the EU anyway. Yes, I guess EU citizens could find my site. Yes, maybe they live in other countries, but it's probably not most. We mostly operate in North America. It's not a big deal. The problem with this as a concept or as a solution is that it ignores the global impact of GDPR now. So since GDPR passed, California has passed their own state law. There is currently no U.S. federal law that's even in discussion as far as I'm aware of. But California has passed a law where they took a lot of the components of GDPR and that's enforced today in California. And in addition, I know a lot of us are Washington businesses too, is Washington does have an upcoming law. It's already passed the House and currently it's in committee in Washington. all signs would point that it's likely to pass, and it's basically a little bit stronger than the California law, but less than GDPR standards. Also, since GDPR passed, Japan has rolled out a law, Brazil has passed one, in Australia, and I think South Korea has one too. It's becoming a global standard, and so it's rolled across all over. I doubt a lot of international companies are like, let's just block the entire EU, and Japan, and Brazil, and Australia, and then on as they keep adding more areas. So it's better to get on board with it. Secondly, is we've seen a lot of people ignore GDPR. I'll say this is the most common response we've seen so far, is people just saying, it's early, let's not worry about it. The idea is that it's going to get easier and cheaper to implement and roll out technology-wise in the long run, which is totally true. And right now, most cases just end with a warning. And so the idea is it's still early, so you still have time. And so let's just wait for the dust to settle. Let's just wait it out, and then eventually we'll figure out what the standard is when we're not like bleeding edge, cutting edge into the thing. The risk there is obviously you're not even demonstrating that you're trying. And so, you are opening yourself open to fines potentially. And then finally, it's just implement the change within the organization. For purposes of this webinar, we're just going to assume that one's the case for the rest of it. Even if the first two options sound good, that's fine. If you guys want to make that choice. But I will keep going as if we're going to talk about how to implement. So, implementation. So, I alluded to this earlier. It is most similar, I think, to like cybersecurity. There's like this IT initiative where just everybody knows, yes, there's some ongoing cost. Yes, it's something that has to get set up. Yes, it's something that's important. We just have to do it. It's not an optional component for most organizations. It's just something that now needs to exist. They definitely mean GDPR to be like that. It's just like you keep your data secure and you keep your everything ongoingly updated to make sure you're in compliance. They want GDPR and data privacy to be that same way. We just modeled out this as like a change process. There's sort of a one-time piece of discovery, which is really understanding throughout the whole organization how you use data today, and then really like what are the organizational needs for that data. Like do you need to retain all the data forever? Do you need this to collect this information? Because it's a lot easier if you just don't need it and you don't think you ever will, then just don't collect it. And then obviously assign leadership throughout all the different departments and throughout the organization, so that way you can know things and sort of lay out responsibility so that way they can be contextualized per group. So then the next three are sort of a loop. Planning, so you plan changes that they need to be made, establish schedules, task budgets, et cetera, to do them. Obviously, the first implementation push is much bigger than further updates in the future. But basically, you just need a good plan, and then you need to project manage that throughout the organization. You then make those changes and make sure that goes well. Documentation is a requirement. I don't have all the specifics offhand, but there is a notion of like change logs, retention policies, various like procedural documents over, hey, if somebody requests something, how do I get this information back out? Those changes need to get rolled out, as that's going to be a long process, and then making sure we're documenting changes that occur. And then honestly, somebody just needs to then stay aware, like they got to be alert and pay attention to what's happening with data. You can imagine in a larger organization, it would be very easy for a new marketing department to roll out a new way of doing marketing forms, but they never told the legal department, and legal's in charge of your data privacy and compliance. And so now there's this new tool set that's being used that does not abide by your organizational standards. So it's something where you're continually testing and validating that your organization is still up to date and your policies still apply, as well as continually training new people and new departments or new approaches of how do you be safe and respectful of data over time. This process of continually evaluating and auditing will then naturally create new tasks, which then need to get planned, which then need to get implemented, and on and on. So a couple to-do lists, just at a high level, is the legal department. I have one for legal, operations, and technology. So the legal department, we've typically seen as the leaders of this as an initiative. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't have to be, but they are the people that are best equipped to contextualize all the minutia of the law into the organization's needs and like what is the data they're using, where is it stored, how is it stored, how is it utilized, etc. And so they have this concept in the law called a data protection officer. It is required if you're publicly traded. If you're not publicly traded, it's just recommended. But this is a person who is part of their listed job duties is they're in charge of data privacy and data protection. They are the person that then guides organizational change. Most likely this will be a high-level manager. They're also supposed to stay up to date in the field, and so as the law evolves, or now that we have multiple countries that are doing similar data privacy laws or multiple states, the exact minutia of each of those jurisdictions is unfortunately totally different. And so, like, how do you make sure that you're doing standards that comply with all of them that implemented? They also would want the legal department. We talked earlier about making sure that everything was really clear and easily articulated. And when it comes to privacy policies and opt-in requirements, is the language of that needs to be really unambiguous about what are they opting into. So this is writing a new GDPR-centric privacy and data use policy. Around May of last year, you saw that everybody was updating. Everybody was updating their privacy policies basically everywhere. Basically, the 24 hours before the deadline, all the big companies were rolling out new privacy policies. So there is frameworks in place already of like what are the different standards. A lot of times people don't have automated tools yet to comply with requests. So I want all the information, I want to update the information, et cetera. Like a lot of those are not automatic yet. Instead, what legal departments are opting to do is they write a really good, high-level, plain English privacy policy and data use handbook or guidelines. Those are published publicly, and it's basically, hey, if you want to make a request or you want to see the data we have on you, please email GDPR at whatever the company is, and that goes to somebody in the legal department, and then they basically then have a little project to manage fulfilling that request throughout back to the user within the month time frame. Likewise, they want to assist with marketing and consent language. That language is just really critical again. And then they work with internal teams and vendors on their data use and training of data use. Remember that there's an idea of controller or joint controller, and so you are also like co-liable for what your vendors might use your data for if they have access to that data. And so you want to make sure that your vendors are also using your customers' data, your users' data in a really compliant and smart way. Then for operations group, we sort of see their key role as the process change agents. They're also like the leaders of documentation. So there's going to be, especially in the beginning, this very unique, gigantic list of little tasks that need to happen once your organization decides what needs to happen to get into compliance or to make efforts to comply with the law. So first is like just work through that gigantic list. Like that's a big project management list. There's a lot of things that need to happen there. But then once we're down through that list originally, then there also needs to be that ongoing assessment that we talked about. And so we see this working really well inside of an operations group because they see more about how the whole company operates. And so there'd be some sort of either yearly, every other year, quarterly, whatever, assessment and audit cycle. They would also want to establish a way of doing an audit trail for data access. So this user has access to this marketing data, this user has this access to this HR data, et cetera. They'd also want to establish clear data use and retention policies. So we are allowed to use data in this ways. We are allowed to make new segments in these ways. We are allowed to make automated campaigns in these ways, et cetera. And then they have a process for user-generated requests. And so if legal is going to basically make sure we're going to be in compliance by making sure that we can't even do the requests, but somebody has to actually like go out and do that work. And so if somebody says, hey, I want a copy of all my data so I can tell you what data you need to update, which is kind of like, in my head, I was like, man, that would be a very difficult request to pull off. Somebody has to go forth and actually like go through all the data and find, does Jim Smith exist? And then pull out everything in a digestible way. And remember that data has to be interoperable with other systems. And so you got to pull out in a way that's useful. and then give that to them, let them make changes, and then give it back to you, and then re-put that back in your systems again. There is technologies that are coming out that are basically automatic ways to do these, to comply with requests. Honestly, we're not seeing many of our clients where there's a lot of requests. It might be like a couple a quarter. So it's not a huge lift yet. But like, Twitter, Facebook, the big brands, like building an automated engine around these sort of things makes a lot of sense. We'll see what happens. There's another train coming, hooray, but we'll see how it goes. And then what happens in a breach? So there is this special moment that could happen where normally it's like, all right, here's the process, we're operating, we're fine, we have a company that really respects users' data, we're good, but then something could happen. That could be a public-facing breach, like you get hacked, or it could be an internal breach, as in your employees who shouldn't have access to data and do bad things with it. So you then have to have some sort of internal documented policies about what happens in that 72 hours, so you can detect that it happened and then make sure notices go out. Then for technical, we see really their role is trying to build as many automated paths as possible and then implementing the big list of tasks. This isn't always the case. Some of those big list of tasks are just procedural or documentation or writing or more about change management inside of a process of how people operate. But there's a lot of things that are user-facing that are more technical. And so this means that the way you guys do forms and data collection on all your websites, if you have 20 websites, all 20 need a little bit of updating. This means how you do all your analytics and all your tracking. You think of Google Tag Manager or manually put in tags or all the little tiny pieces that get tracked on a website or an application. All those things, all the tracking can still occur, but it needs to happen after consent has explicitly been given. And so like there's just technical changes that need to happen about the load order of third-party trackers and files based on user opt-in. A couple things about also the pop-up box or the consent box is that checkboxes cannot be pre-selected. And so sometimes you see these pop up and they say, by using this website, you agree that you will let us use all your data. That is a blanket statement, so technically that's not allowed. Then there's checkboxes where the user has opted in, but you've pre-selected it. Technically, that's also not great. What you're supposed to do is just say, do this. If by default the answer is no, unless they manually opt in by checking the box themselves. That is typically what we don't actually see people doing, but that's the way we understand it as it should be done. Another one is about various types of tracking that can be approved separately, is wherever possible if you have types of trackers. So we want to collect your transaction checkout data, might be a different consent than we want to use your data for marketing purposes. So this is supposed to be something where users have multiple selection choices where they can pick how their data is going to be used. And then the hard part with all this is the users are then, the next bullet point is they're supposed to be able to update their consent in the future. And so some of our websites are great because they're an application and they're meant for people to log in and see their account and where's my order at or those sort of things, so you have a natural place for that. But for just a random visitor to your website, like how do you help them update their consent in the future? If they were fine with you tracking them for the first 2 months, but then they come back 2 months later and now they want to opt out, you have to make sure that there's some options for that. They also you want to implement the ability for users to see, remove, or update their data. We talked about it earlier, and individual rights. Like I said, a lot of times this is still done manually, but there is automated ways to implement that. It depends a little bit on your technical stack and about how your data is organized and where this database is stored. But it is technically possible to automate a lot of that. The consent forms. So forms are supposed to have extra implicit consent. And so you think of a form where it's like, hey, I want to order a bunch of whatever. That is an order form. There's probably a name, email, phone number, something about that's uniquely identifying of that person filling out the form. There should be an extra consent option on that. You also the technical team needs to update data settings in all your various software tools. I know when the law first came out, there's a lot of new setting options around data privacy in Google Analytics. same as like Google Webmaster, Google Ads, Adobe Analytics, etc. And so you have to go through and update your settings in those things to make sure you're within compliance of the way you guys want to implement the policies. And then lastly, this one's big, but it is possible to build and implement tools to automate as many of those user requests as possible. Again, we wouldn't recommend that unless you guys are dealing with a significant volume of requests, which is something we have not seen yet in the States. But if there's a broader rollout here in the States, I could see this happening more. So just something to keep in mind is there should be ways to automate stuff wherever you can. That's about it on the high level. There's obviously a lot more detail. Happy also to like send out some links of some really great online European resources about how to implement things on a technical way. So we can send that out via an email or something later if you would like. But that's about all. So thank you. I really appreciate everybody's time, and I'm available for questions. We got another like 10, 15 minutes if people have any questions. I'm pretty nerdy, so I can handle some nerdy ones.
We'll try to find you some nerdy questions, Paul. Awesome. I'll just remind everybody on the line here that you can go ahead and type your question in the webinar dashboard, and we will definitely address it to Paul and his team here. We do have a few questions here. How do GDPR fines work? Do they accumulate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a little bit discretionary. So it's a case basis is what we understand, meaning that basically, let's say there's a breach, the EU is then going to investigate that breach, or it can be like you can basically be like tattled on. You can like be told like, hey, these people are using my data poorly. So then EU will then also investigate that. So our understanding is it's not per occurrence, or it's not per user based fines. It's not 4% per user, 4% of yearly global revenue per user that is breached. It's more of a aggregate case by case basis. That is good. Again, most of the time they're doing warnings right now. But my guess is that if there's repeated warnings to the same organizations where they're flagrantly abusing user data, then it's going to be a bigger problem where you'll see some big fines.
Great, thank you. Another question here: how can Graybox help with compliance?
Yeah, we can help with compliance in a couple different ways. Aside from GDPR, our consulting team basically works with other organizations around like other big complicated ones. So like if you're medical, like HIPAA compliance or payments with PCI compliance or ADA compliance and that sort of stuff. Again, we're not a law firm, so we're a little bit limited in like how we want to recommend what is done. But we basically partner with organizations to help them understand what is the law and how does it work in conjunction with their legal departments. And then a lot of times we're the advisor from a technical level of then how do we go forth and get that implemented or validate. I mentioned like operations, like that big list of tasks, like we can help you make that big list of tasks. And then you are probably, or your team is probably going to be the ones that carry out to make sure those are done. But a lot of those tasks are going to be done at a technical level as they apply to your website or web applications or mobile apps or whatever you guys have, server infrastructure, marketing infrastructure, et cetera. And so then we can also take on that list to then get those accomplished for you because your team might not have time or attention to do so. And then lastly, some of our clients use us as like their ongoing strategic advisors for all things internet related. And I would definitely put like cybersecurity and data privacy in that category. And so in those cases, we definitely are like retained to be advisors. And so as laws change or things are happening in the market that impact the business, then we bring those up in some sort of like quarterly or yearly discussion meetings where we sort of talk through what are the new things that might impact that organization. Great.
I'll give one last call out here. If any of our audience members have questions, please type them in the dashboard. While they do that, Paul, I'll ask you this question. Many of our PNDC members, either defense contractors or subcontractors, are facing a lot of new cybersecurity requirements. Are there advantages to implementing cybersecurity and privacy compliance at the same time?
Yeah, they're definitely interrelated. Data privacy is a little bit more about I have the data and how does the organization use that data. And cybersecurity is more about like collection of that data in a secure way and then maintaining your security, like maintaining a wall outside of it. But they definitely are interrelated because they typically are like, your data is stored in a database, and cybersecurity is you're defending that database to make sure that it stays safe and intact. So there's probably some definite efficiency gains by sort of tackling initiatives in that same way. Cybersecurity is definitely owned by like IT or information departments typically, where GDPR we're seeing more on like the operations and legal side, but they're connected.
Great. Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate your sharing your considerable expertise. A few reminders here. PNDC does have some upcoming events. This Thursday, we'll be having an online webinar similar to this on importing and exporting factors that impact Northwest businesses. On May 16th, we'll have a happy hour in Tacoma. Our annual Supply Chain Opportunities Conference in the Columbia River Gorge will be May 23rd, an opportunity to hear how to do business with companies like In Situ, Bigger, and Siemens. And then we will have Department of Homeland Security buyers coming out in June. They'll have an event in both Seattle and in Portland. So, Paul, thank you once again. We really appreciate your support.
Yeah.
We will follow up with this webinar with a link to the recording of the presentation, a copy of the slide deck, and also information on contacting Graybox if you'd like some more information about them helping you with anything connected to the internet. Do I have that right, Paul?
Yeah, that's the high level, but there's details there.
Awesome. And just a reminder to all our attendees following the webinar, there'll be a short 3-question survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this program. Thank you again. That concludes our webinar today.